All right, so photosynthesis. Starting at the very top, you're going to notice where it says photosynthesis, we've got a couple of arrows. We're going to use that space to put in our equation. Now, this is something you should already be familiar with from 7th grade. Granted, that was 2 years ago, but it is something that when you see it, it might remind you like, oh yeah, I've seen that before. So at the very top where we put our equation, we're going to have 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O. And that's going to yield, when our arrow means yield, not equals, that's going to yield C6H12O6, which is glucose, plus 6O2, which is our oxygen. Now, we're going to talk about where those sixes there in just a second. But to write this out, to make sure we understand what our reactants and our products are, this is carbon dioxide plus water. And that's going to yield our glucose plus our oxygen. All of those coordinate with each other. Now, one thing that we need to do whenever we're creating an equation for a chemical reaction, so this is supposed to be a model for chemical reactions, okay? Whenever we use a model for chemical reactions, specifically an equation like this, if it requires energy, we have to indicate where the energy is needed. So for this reaction to take place, if you recall photosynthesis, photo meaning light, we do require energy, and we're going to write it right above our arrow, and we're going to put sun. Sometimes you're going to see this spelled out as light energy. This is light energy, but obviously light energy that's coming from the sun because we're talking about plants. And so we'll include that here as well. All right. Now, the reason for these sixes that I've added here is so that we can follow the law of conservation of mass or the law of conservation of matter. You may recall the law of conservation of energy from 8th grade when you talked about chemistry, when you looked at physics. We can't create or destroy matter. Whatever we start with, we have to end up with. And when we have a chemical reaction that occurs like photosynthesis, what we do is we take apart the bonds holding the atoms together that form carbon dioxide, that form water, and we separate them. It requires energy to break those apart. But however many carbons, how many oxygens, however many hydrogens we have on one side have to equal the amount on the other side. And without these coefficients, hopefully you remember coefficients from chemistry in 8th grade. Without these coefficients, they wouldn't balance out. You wouldn't have the same number of carbon on both sides. You wouldn't have the same number of hydrogen or oxygen. And so it'd be unbalanced, and it wouldn't be following the law of conservation of mass. Okay? That's why those coefficients are there. If we're just going to write it out in words, we don't need to put the amounts. We're just looking at what's going in, what's coming out, right? Excuse me. All right. Now, all of this is going to take place within this whole process of photosynthesis is going to take place within one very special organelle found in plant cells that we call the chloroplast. So right here in the middle, this is our chloroplast. Chloroplast. Now, the plant cell, specifically found in the leaves, right? Chloroplasts, specifically found in the leaves, are going to have multiple chloroplasts. Inside the chloroplast, we have these little discs. They kind of look like green pancakes or a stack of coins. They are connected to each other, but all of these represent thylakoids. You don't really need to know that. You don't need to write it down, but that's what these structures are called. Okay? It's within these structures that photosynthesis is going to occur, right? So inside the chloroplast, within the thylakoids, we're going to start to get all the materials necessary from CO2, from H2O, including our light energy, so that we can start making glucose and oxygen. Keep this in mind. Plants will do this to make their own food. They're autotrophic, so they're going to create their own food, and they create their food in the form of glucose, which they're going to use for energy. They also have mitochondria. The difference here is they don't have to eat food to make sure their mitochondria can provide energy for their cells. They get to make their own within the chloroplast. All right. So the chloroplast, we're going to identify that as the site of photosynthesis, right? And this is something you should already have in your notes from when we looked at organelles. And it is predominantly found in the leaves of plants. Mostly found in the leaves. Now keep in mind, the whole point of the leaf, we looked at plant parts recently, the whole point of the leaf is to be a nice broad area for sunlight to hit it so that we can actually undergo this process of photosynthesis. Now when we look at the ingredients for photosynthesis, we're going to start with the sun, and it's okay if yours is not color-coded. We're going to start with the sun, which is represented by our sun right here. We get sunlight, and sunlight is going to go towards the chloroplast to the thylakoids and power the process required to start making some of the ingredients we need for photosynthesis. It's going to take the bonds holding these together and it's going to start moving things around so that we can get the energy where it needs to go, so we can take the electrons that we need for bonding and send them to the appropriate place within the chloroplast to start putting all this stuff together. And there's a pretty good analogy that I'm going to go over here in just a second that should hopefully make this make sense. Now, our little smiley person here has an arrow that's going out of their mouth. Looking at what we require for photosynthesis, we know we need sunlight energy, according to our arrow. We're also going to need carbon dioxide. Where does that come from? Well, carbon dioxide is going to come from organisms that breathe. If I can spell right. So any organism that breathes oxygen is most likely going to exhale CO2. Obviously, people will do this, animals will do this. We'll breathe out CO2. CO2 will find its way into the chloroplast through those special cells on the surface of the leaf, the stoma. I mentioned this when we looked at sections of the leaf, the parts that you actually needed to know. The stoma have guard cells that allow them to open and close. This allows them to exchange gases with the environment. So it needs CO2. It produces a lot of oxygen, so it'll trade. It'll send out oxygen and bring in CO2 through these little openings in the leaves that are regulated by the guard cells. They don't want to stay open all the time because on a hot day, a lot of the water within the plant would evaporate. And they do lose a little bit of water through these openings every time they open and close to allow CO2 to enter and oxygen to leave. But if they were open all the time, that'd be bad for the plant. So they depend on organisms that breathe out CO2 to provide them with the materials necessary to create glucose. And then last but not least, looking at what we have here, we're also going to need water. And this is going to get into the chloroplast from the roots, right? So from the roots, they're going to travel through the vascular tissue to the leaves where they can find their way into the chloroplast to provide it with the hydrogen that it also needs to create glucose. All of these are the reactants. One way to look at this, these are the ingredients for what we're trying to make. And in a plant, since this is food for the plant, one way that I've compared this for other students before is this carbon, this oxygen, this hydrogen. These are like ingredients when you want to make a pizza. You need dough, you need sauce, you need cheese, and then other toppings. If you had all those ingredients, set them on a table, it's not a pizza. They may be all next to each other. They may be all the ingredients you would use to make one, but just because they're in the same area, or maybe I bought them all at the store at the same time and put them in the same bag, it's still not a pizza yet. It's all the parts I need, but it's not a pizza until I arrange it in a very specific way. And we have an idea of what it should look like. It should be probably round, right? There's an order that we would arrange it. We put the dough first, then the sauce, then the cheese, then the toppings or whatever, right? So there's a way to do it to become what we want it to be. The same thing happens here. This looks very simple. The process is actually pretty intricate. There are 9 different chemical processes that occur to take all of our ingredients and put them together, not to mention the processes that take everything apart. So it is very complex, and we're not going to go into all the details of that. But we take the sunlight energy to help take CO2 and H2O and break the bonds that hold them together so we can have the ingredients necessary to make glucose. It's going to require energy to put these bonds together and to make sure that they're arranged properly. C6H12O6, if it's not in the right shape, isn't glucose. And we know that our carbohydrates need to be hexagon or pentagon shaped. So it's important that we get things lined up properly to become what we want it to be. Interestingly enough, oxygen, notice the arrow coming in, this is oxygen that we breathe. And obviously any other organism that breathes oxygen is going to leave the chloroplast and find its way out into the atmosphere, into the air for us and any other organism that breathes oxygen. It needs oxygen for its mitochondria. Mitochondria requires oxygen for cellular respiration to get energy for the cell. However, plants make a lot of oxygen. They make way more than they need. In fact, let's say, for example, that it makes this much oxygen, I can talk. It only needs like this much to stay alive. So this huge surplus of oxygen has no place in the plant. They don't need it. It's excessive, so they get rid of it. And the best thing they can do is get rid of it so they can make room for the CO2 that they need to continue to make glucose. They'll use a little bit in their mitochondria the same way that we do, but they make so much of it, they can afford to get rid of most of it. They just keep the part they need, and that way they've got enough room for all the stuff they want. The other thing that we get, the most important part, is going to be glucose. Glucose, there's our glucose molecule. And if you look at what it's made of, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, there's a specific ratio to how many carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens we need. And they're not all going to match up here because this is just a simplified diagram to represent glucose. But the whole point of photosynthesis, and if you had to like summarize all of this, the whole point of photosynthesis, maybe write it down like right here. The whole point is to make glucose. The whole point is to make glucose. Why? This is food. This is food for the plant, and obviously it's food for us as well. So when we eat a plant, they've produced a certain amount of glucose that they store within themselves that they are using for fuel. When we eat them, we're able to take some of that glucose from them and use it for our cells. Okay? But the whole point is to make glucose. Once they do that, they have the fuel necessary to continue to stay alive, to go through all of their cellular processes as well. Trying to see if there's anything else that I left off. That's pretty much it. So I'm going to stop recording.